She was 19 years old, pregnant and sick, and on a warm June night in 1855, she stood inside a small brick cabin with a wooden stick in her hand, waiting for the man who owned her to walk through the door one final time. She had begged him to stop. She had pleaded with his own daughters to make him stop. She had warned him, more than once, that she would not endure it again. He did not listen, and when he opened that door, something happened inside that cabin that would end with his body burning in her fireplace, her name on trial for murder, and a question the state of Missouri was never prepared to answer. Did an enslaved woman have any right at all to say no? This is the true story of Celia, a young enslaved woman whose desperate act of self-defense exposed the rotten heart of American slavery and whose fight for justice would not be answered for 170 years. To understand what drove Celia to that breaking point, you have to first understand the world she was born into, a world where a woman's body could legally belong to someone else. By the 1850s, the state of Missouri sat on a fault line in American history. It was a slave state, but a border one, surrounded by free territory, caught in the center of a national argument that was growing louder and angrier with every passing year. Just 1 year before Celia's story reached its violent end, Congress had passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, reopening the explosive question of whether new American territories would allow slavery at all. The country was a powder keg, and in the quiet farmland of Callaway County, Missouri, far from the courtrooms of Washington, a much smaller and far more personal battle was unfolding, one that would put the entire legal foundation of slavery on trial. Callaway County was a place of rolling fields and modest farms, where men built their fortunes on tobacco, livestock, and the unpaid labor of human beings they considered property. One of those men was Robert Newsom. Around 1820, Newsom had left his home in Virginia and traveled west with his family, eventually settling along the Middle River in southern Callaway County. By 1850, he had built himself into a prosperous farmer, the kind of man respected at church and trusted at the courthouse. He owned 800 acres of land. He owned horses, cattle, sheep, and hogs, and he owned people. By the time his story would collide with Celia's, Robert Newsom enslaved 5 men on his farm. But in the summer of 1850, his wife having died the year before, Newsom decided his household needed something else. He traveled to neighboring Audrain County and purchased a 6th slave, a girl, 14 years old. Her name was Celia. Celia would have known, the moment she was led away from everything familiar, that her life was no longer her own in any sense the law would recognize. She did not know yet just how completely that would prove true. On the long journey back to the Newsom farm, in a wagon moving slowly across the Missouri countryside, Robert Newsom raped her for the first time. She was 14 years old. He was nearly 70. It was, according to the historical record that survives, likely the very first time Celia ever stepped onto Newsom's land, already carrying the weight of an assault that the law of Missouri would never let her call by its true name, because to the law, what happened to her body was not a crime. It was simply a man making use of his own property. Back at the farm, Newsom did not place Celia among his other enslaved workers. He built her a separate cabin, made of solid brick, sturdier than most slave dwellings of the time, located a short distance from his own house, close enough to reach easily, far enough to keep his secret from his grown daughters who still lived under his roof. Some historians believe Newsom deliberately isolated Celia from the other enslaved people on Marquette, the only black woman among 5 enslaved men, ensuring she could not easily form friendships or alliances that might protect her. Whatever his exact intentions, the result was the same. Celia was alone. Utterly alone, in a world built to silence her, with a man who visited her cabin whenever he pleased for 5 long years. Imagine those years. Imagine the sound of footsteps approaching that cabin door in the dark, night after night, year after year, knowing there was no lock strong enough, no law generous enough, no voice loud enough to make it stop. Between 1850 and 1855, Celia gave birth to 2 children. At least one of them, court records would later confirm, was Newsom's own son. Under Missouri law, that fact changed nothing. The children born from those assaults were not seen as his responsibility. They were simply more property, added to his estate, born into the very system that had created their suffering in the first place. Celia raised them in that same small cabin, carrying both motherhood and unending violation under one roof, year after year, with no one in the world legally bound to protect her. At some point during those years, in the middle of all that grief, Celia found something that almost felt like choice. She began a relationship with another enslaved man on the farm, a man named George. Whether it was love, comfort, or simply the desperate human need to feel something that belonged to her and no one else, the surviving record does not fully say. But George became important to her in a way that Robert Newsom never could be, and in early 1855, that relationship would collide directly with the abuse she had been enduring for half a decade, forcing Celia toward a decision no 19-year-old should ever have to make. In the late winter of 1855, Celia discovered she was pregnant for the third time. This time, she did not know who the father was. It could have been George. It could have been Newsom. The uncertainty itself became its own kind of torment, a reminder of just how thoroughly her body had been claimed by two different men under two entirely different sets of rules, one shaped by tenderness, the other by raw power. When George learned of the pregnancy, he gave Celia an ultimatum that must have felt impossible to satisfy. He told her plainly that he would have nothing more to do with her unless she ended whatever was happening with Newsom. For Celia, this was not a simple romantic complication. It was a demand to stop something she had never had the power to control in the first place. Desperate, sick from her pregnancy, and pushed to a breaking point 5 years in the making, Celia did something extraordinarily brave for an enslaved woman in 1850s Missouri. She went, not to Newsom himself first, but to his own daughters, Mary and Virginia, women close to her own age, hoping that perhaps a woman's voice might carry weight where her own could not. She told them she was unwell, that her pregnancy was difficult, and she asked that their father be made to leave her alone. It is hard not to imagine the courage that conversation required, and harder still to imagine the silence, or perhaps the quiet shame, that must have followed when nothing changed at all. When pleading with his daughters failed, Celia turned to the only person left who might listen, Robert Newsom himself. Sometime around June 23, 1855, sick, pregnant, and exhausted, Celia begged him directly to leave her in peace. She told him she did not feel well enough to bear what he intended to do to her that night. Newsom's answer was as simple as it was chilling. He told her plainly that he would be coming to her cabin that night regardless. 5 years of pleading, 5 years of enduring, and in this single moment, Celia understood with absolute clarity that nothing she said would ever be enough to stop him. Something would have to change, and if no one else would change it, she would have to do it herself. That same day, while the Newsom household carried on with its ordinary routines, unaware of the storm quietly building inside one small brick cabin, Celia made her preparations. She brought a large stick into her cabin, the kind of heavy wood used for ordinary farm chores, and she waited. We can only imagine the hours that followed. The sun setting slowly over the fields, the sounds of the Newsom family settling in for the night in the main house, the silence pressing in around her as darkness fell. Did she hope, even then, that he might change his mind? Did she rehearse, again and again, the words she would say if given one final chance to stop him with nothing but pleading? Whatever hope she carried into that evening, it would not survive the night. After the rest of the Newsom household had gone to sleep, Robert Newsom walked the short distance from his house to Celia's cabin, just as he had told her he would. He stepped inside, and once again he refused to listen to her objections, refused to turn away, refused to treat her plea as anything more than an inconvenience standing between him and what he believed he was entitled to take. Celia, finally and completely out of options, raised the stick she had hidden and struck him across the head. According to her own later confession, she did not intend, in that first blow, to kill him. She only wanted to make him stop. to hurt him enough that he would finally leave her alone. But Newsom did not fall. He reached his arms out toward her, as though to grab her, to overpower her one final time, exactly as he had done for 5 relentless years. And Celia, in that single terrifying instant, swung the stick a second time. This blow killed him instantly. For a long moment, in the silence of that small cabin, with her own children asleep nearby, completely unaware of what had just happened only feet away from them, Celia stood over the body of the man who had stolen her childhood, fathered children he would never acknowledge as his own, and ignored every plea she had ever made for mercy. The man who had controlled every single aspect of her existence for 5 years was now lying dead at her feet, and in an instant the entire balance of power between them had violently, irreversibly shifted. But killing him was only the beginning of an impossible night. Celia now faced a question with no good answer. What does a 19-year-old enslaved girl do with the body of the man who legally owns her, her children, and the very cabin she is standing in? There was no one she could call, no authority she could appeal to, no version of this story where simply telling the truth would save her life. So Celia made a decision, born purely out of raw desperation. She dragged Newsom's body to her fireplace, built up the flames, and began to burn it, working through the night while her 2 children slept on, undisturbed by the horror unfolding only feet from where they lay. The fire did not consume everything. By morning, fragments of bone remained, scattered among the ashes, refusing to disappear the way she desperately needed them to. With the sun rising and the household soon to stir, Celia took a rock and began crushing the cilia, smaller remaining bones into pieces small enough to scatter, hiding the larger fragments beneath the hearth and beneath the floorboards of her own cabin, the same space where she had endured 5 years of assault and where she now hid the evidence of the single night she had finally fought back. It is one of the most haunting images in this entire story. A teenage girl, alone, kneeling over a fireplace at dawn, trying desperately to erase a body, with absolutely nowhere else to turn. Later that same morning, in a detail that still unsettles historians more than a century and a half later, Celia approached Newsom's own 12-year-old grandson, a boy named Coffee Wainscott, and asked for his help carrying ashes from her fireplace out to be scattered along a path near the Sivers stable. The boy, with no idea what he was actually helping to dispose of, carried away the final remains of his own grandfather without ever knowing it. Childhood and horror sat side by side that morning on the Newsom farm, separated only by a secret one terrified young woman was desperately trying to keep. It did not take long for the secret to unravel. When Robert Newsom failed to appear that day, his family grew anxious, then alarmed. A search began, drawing in neighbors and family members determined to find out what had happened to him. The search eventually turned toward George, Celia's lover, who, fearing for his own life and likely sensing exactly where suspicion would fall, told the search party that he had last seen Newsom heading toward Celia's woods the night before. With that single sentence, the full weight of what had happened began closing in around her, and the careful, frantic work of an entire desperate night was suddenly hanging by nothing more than a confession away from collapsing completely. Celia was brought in for questioning, first gently, then with mounting pressure as inconsistencies in her story began to surface. Under sustained, relentless interrogation, she eventually confessed to killing Robert Newsom, but even in that confession, surrounded by men who held complete power over her fate, Celia held on to one fierce, unshakable line of protection. She insisted, again and again, that George had played no role whatsoever in the killing or in the disposal of the body. Even facing her own likely execution, she refused to let her confession become his downfall as well. It is a small detail buried in dense legal records, but it speaks volumes about who Celia truly was beneath the unbearable weight of what had been done to her. The discovery of Newsom's remains, charred bone fragments pulled from beneath her cabin floor and from the ashes near the stable path, confirmed every horrifying detail of her account. On June 25, 1855, just 2 days after the killing, a formal complaint was filed, and Celia was bowled for the murder of the man who had owned her since she was 14 years old. She was taken to the Callaway County Jail in Fulton, roughly 9 miles from the farm where she had spent 5 years in captivity, to await a trial that would force the state of Missouri to confront a question it had never wanted to answer. Honestly, did the law protect an enslaved woman's body at all, or only her owner's property rights to it? While awaiting trial, in conditions about which little detail survives, but which can scarcely be imagined as anything but bleak, Celia endured another devastating blow. At some point during her incarceration, she gave birth to a child who did not survive. She faced this loss utterly alone, behind bars, already condemned in the eyes of nearly everyone around her, carrying grief upon grief with no one permitted by law to offer her comfort as anything other than property awaiting judgment. Celia's trial began on October 9, 1855, in a Callaway County courtroom thick with tension that extended far beyond her individual case. The nation outside was tearing itself apart over slavery, and here, in this single courtroom, the question had narrowed down to one specific, devastating point. Could the word woman, as written into Missouri's own statute against rape, possibly include an enslaved woman like Celia? The law was explicit that it was a crime to force any woman against her will, through violence or threat to be sexually violated. Her defense team intended to argue that this protection belonged to Celia exactly as it belonged to any other woman in the state, and that she had been entirely justified under existing law in using force to defend herself against exactly that kind of violation. Remarkably, given the era and the place, Celia's appointed defense was not careless or token. Judge William Augustus Hall assigned her 3 attorneys: John Jameson, an experienced and well-respected trial lawyer who was, in one of history's bitter irony, himself a slave owner, alongside Nathan Chapman Cons and a recent law graduate named Isaac Bulwer. Jameson built his entire defense around a daring legal argument. He insisted that the criminal statutes of Missouri made no racial distinction in defining who qualified as a victim of sexual violence, and that Celia, exactly like any other woman in the state, possessed the legal right to use deadly force if necessary to stop a rape in progress. It was an argument almost no one expected a court in a slaveholding state to seriously entertain, and it placed the entire legal architecture of slavery directly in the crosshairs of a single trial. But Missouri's enslaved people were forbidden by law from testifying in their own defense, whenever their words might contradict the account of a white person. Celia could not stand before that jury and describe, in her own voice, the 5 years of suffering that had led her to that cabin on that final night. Her story survived only through the second-hand testimony of others, through confessions extracted under pressure, through fragments and reports filtered entirely through white voices before ever reaching the jury's ears. The woman at the absolute center of this entire case was, by the design of the very system on trial, denied any direct voice in her own defense. The jury itself told its own story before a single argument had even been made. 12 men, all of them white, all of them farmers, 4 of them slave owners themselves, sat in judgment of a case, asking whether an enslaved woman had the right to resist her own master's sexual violence. It would be difficult to imagine a jury less likely to extend that protection, no matter how carefully or persuasively Jameson argued the law. When it came time to instruct the jury on how to weigh the case, Judge Hall delivered what may be the single most consequential decision of the entire trial. He flatly refused Jameson's request to instruct jurors that Missouri's rape statute extended its protections to enslaved women. He refused to allow the jury any path toward acquitting Celia on grounds of self-defense, or toward recognizing that she might have been legally justified in resisting Newsom's sexual demands at all. Without that instruction, jurors were left to consider only the bare fact that an enslaved woman had killed the white man who owned her, stripped of the deeper context that had driven her to that breaking point. The verdict that followed felt, in hindsight, almost predetermined by that single ruling. On October 10, 1855, after the briefest of deliberations, the jury found Celia guilty of murder in the first degree. 3 days later, Judge Hall sentenced her to death, setting her execution for November 16, 1855. Celia's defense team, refusing to accept what felt like a deeply unjust outcome, filed a motion for retrial, citing what they believed was judicial misconduct in Hall's handling of the case. The judge overruled them without hesitation. They pressed forward anyway, filing an appeal to the Missouri Supreme Court, the last possible avenue left to save her life, though the trial judge refused to grant any stay of execution while that appeal proceeded. In an act of sheer desperation, 5 days before her scheduled execution, Celia escaped from the Callaway County Jail alongside another enslaved person, also awaiting execution. Some historians have speculated, based on the surrounding circumstances, that her own attorneys may have quietly assisted in that escape, hoping that buying time might force the Missouri Supreme Court to actually hear her case before the state could carry out her hanging. For several desperate days in early December of 1855, Celia existed somewhere beyond the reach of the system that had already condemned her, the closest she had come to freedom in 5 entire years. But it could not last. She was recaptured and returned to that same Callaway County Jail by Newsom's own grandson, Harry, closing the brief, fragile window of escape almost as quickly as it had opened. On December 14, 1855, the Missouri Supreme Court unanimously rejected the defense's final appeal, refusing even to grant a stay of execution while reviewing the case. Whatever faint hope remained for Celia died with that ruling. On the eve of her execution, questioned one final time, she continued to insist, just as she had from the very beginning, that she had acted entirely alone and had never intended to kill Robert Newsom that night, only to make him stop. In words later recorded by those who spoke with her, Celia described that final terrible moment with haunting simplicity. As soon as she struck him, she said, something inside her seemed to take over completely, and she could not stop herself from striking him again until he was dead, and then she burned him. On December 21, 1855, at 2:30 in the afternoon, Celia was hanged in Fulton, Missouri. She was 19 years old. Her trial had drawn attention from newspapers hundreds of miles away, even reaching abolitionist publications like William Lloyd Garrison's The Liberator and Mary Ann Shadd Cary's Provincial Freeman, published all the way north in Canada. The New York Times itself reported on her execution, but almost none of these distant reports carried the full, devastating context of what had actually driven her to that breaking point. To most of the country reading about her that winter, Celia was simply a slave who had murdered her master, a brief, bloodless headline stripped of 5 years of unspeakable suffering that had led to that single night. For more than a century afterward, Celia's name survived mostly in dusty court records and the quiet, persistent memory of her own descendants, largely forgotten by the wider world. It was not until 1940, when civil rights attorney Margaret Bush Wilson encountered her case, while researching Missouri's legal history, that Celia's story began slowly returning to public memory. Decades later, in 1990, Wilson commissioned an artist named Solomon Thurman to create a portrait imagining Celia's likeness, since no contemporary image or written physical description of her had ever survived. Since 2004, residents of Callaway County have gathered annually to publicly commemorate her life on the anniversary of her execution, a community quietly insisting that her story and the injustice at its center would not simply be allowed to disappear. For Celia's own descendants, the story never truly ended in that Fulton courtroom in 1855. Her daughter Jenny, herself born from the relentless abuse Celia endured, carried the family line forward, eventually giving birth to 13 children of her own. Generations later, those descendants began the painstaking work of tracing their families' history back through slavery's brutal record-keeping, confirming through genealogical and DNA evidence what court documents had already suggested a century and a half earlier, that Robert Newsom himself had fathered children with the teenage girl he once purchased like livestock. For Celia's family, uncovering this history was never about scandal. It was about finally understanding exactly where they came from, and exactly what their ancestor had survived to make their existence possible at all. In 2025, Celia's descendants achieved something that must have once seemed entirely impossible. After years of advocacy and historical research, led in part by the Kingdom of Callaway Historical Society, Missouri Governor Mike Parson issued a posthumous pardon for Celia, formally clearing her name 169 years after the state had taken her life. Descendants from both families, Celia's and even, remarkably, Robert Newsom's own bloodline, spoke openly about the case in the years surrounding that pardon. One of Newsom's own descendants would later ask, in a moment of striking honesty, how anyone might feel if their own 14-year-old daughter had been taken away exactly as Celia once was, adding simply that she was glad Celia had finally stood up for herself, because without that single desperate act of resistance, an entire family line, her own family's descendants among them, would never have existed at all. What happened in that small brick cabin on the Newsom farm in June of 1855 was never really about one man and one woman alone. It was about an entire legal and moral system that had spent generations constructing elaborate justifications for treating human beings as property, a system so complete in its cruelty that it could not even allow a woman to be recognized as a victim of rape if the man committing it happened to legally own her. Celia did not choose violence because she wanted revenge. She chose it because every other door available to her, pleading with Newsom's daughters, pleading with Newsom himself, simply enduring in silence, as countless other enslaved women were forced to do, had already been firmly and repeatedly closed. Nearly 2 centuries later, Celia's story still raises the same unbearable question that haunted that Callaway County courtroom in 1855. What does justice mean inside a system explicitly designed to deny it to an entire class of human beings? The state of Missouri found its answer that October, in a guilty verdict delivered by 12 white men, several of them slave owners themselves, judging a teenage girl for daring to resist the very abuse their own laws permitted against her. It would take this country another 169 years, and the quiet, determined persistence of Celia's own family, to finally offer a different answer. Celia did not live to see herself recognized as anything other than a convicted murderer, but her descendants did. And in that long, painful arc between her execution and her pardon lies perhaps the truest lesson of her story, that history does not always deliver justice in time to save the people who deserve it most, but it does not always forget them either.